What you're looking at here is live coverage of Tahrir Square. We've had this live shot tonight with NBC's Richard Engel and Brian Williams on a balcony overlooking Tahrir Square. The bridge that you see in the foreground here is the October 6th bridge. It goes right into Tahrir Square. The banging that you hear is people banging rhythmically on sheet metal that's been set up essentially as makeshift shields. In this square, the battles, somewhat unexpectedly, at least for us, continued through the night and were quite dramatic over the course of the last few hours. One thing I want to show you here just for a moment before we go live to NBC's Andrea Mitchell. We have an interview that was just shot about an hour ago by Al Jazeera. It's an interview with an anti-Mubarak, anti-government protester inside Tahrir Square. I want to show this to you because I think it gives some important context to why we have seen these dramatic scenes of hand-to-hand fighting and gunfire and firebombs tonight, what the protesters were doing there, and how they saw it from their own perspective. It's a brief interview, but watch this.
Why are you still there?
Because we can't go. We've lost a lot of people, and we've lost them for a cause. The cause is that we wanted Mubarak to be out. We can't just, we owe it to them to stick it till the end. We have many injured people. It will be very hard to move them. And we know, everyone in this square knows, if we decided to give in now, they will hunt us one by one. We've been through this. We know it.
Can you tell us what happened? I know it's difficult, and it's difficult to see, but can you confirm that live gunfire was shot into crowds of unarmed civilians?
Yes. They are shooting. There are people, there are some of the thugs with rifles on the bridge, and they shot at our demonstrators. Every couple of minutes you find the ambulance coming carrying wounded, and every now and then you find them carrying someone dead. People were just praying over, like the latest of our dead protesters. He was shot right through the head. I had two friends watching this happen. I just don't understand what more does the world need to just kick Mubarak out of this country.
An interview shot about 1 hour ago with an anti-government protester inside Tahrir Square in downtown Cairo. Joining us now is Andrea Mitchell, who's NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent. Andrea joins us by phone. Andrea, I know you've been able to see some of this incredibly dramatic overnight footage. Let me just get your base level reaction.
It's so extraordinary to see it, to hear our colleagues there as they describe it and give the context that only Brian and Richard, who's lived there for years before he was in Iraq, can give. And to try to fathom, Rachel, how our government was, by all reports, some experienced foreign policy analysts, some inside the government, acknowledging how our government was caught so flat-footed. Because the State Department has been cabling, our intelligence people have been telling the administration about the economic problems, about the unrest. But once that spark was lit in Tunisia, it should have been apparent that they needed to gear up for this. If there were not a game plan for the end of Mubarak, an 82-year-old, very unpopular leader, before now, there should have been. And they were slow off the mark, and they are on the defensive now. And as Bill Daley, the chief of staff, acknowledged to some of us at a Bloomberg-hosted breakfast this morning, this is out of our control. And that was a very frank acknowledgement from the new chief of staff that this is not something that is going to be determined by Washington. Try, as the president has, to bluntly, candidly, and frankly, when those are strong words used by Robert Gibbs today, tell Mubarak that he has to get out now, and now means yesterday, according to Gibbs' own briefing today. Rachel?
In thinking, Andrea, about the U.S. role here, and it was brought home to me all over again. I just moments ago asked Richard Engel what's going to make the biggest difference now in these next few days about whether or not Mubarak's reign ends, and the first thing he said was U.S. pressure. What could advanced U.S. planning have really done here, given the way that this has fallen apart so quickly? I mean, the protest movement still, at this point, does not seem to have leadership, even as they have designated Mohammed al-Baradei as the man who is speaking for them with the government. What, theoretically, even could the U.S. government do in a situation that's evolving so rapidly?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is evolving at a dizzying pace. And you have to be very nimble. You have to be very adept. The Secretary of State said today we need to be more nimble. We need to respond more quickly. it has seemed a bit lumbering, a little bit passive and reactive. And I'm not saying it's not extraordinarily complicated. They have to think about so many different audiences. They have to think about the other Arab leaders who are watching to see how they treat a valued ally, a key ally in renditions, and a lot of the things that are most controversial about the combat against al-Qaeda has been done with the cooperation of Mubarak and his whole operation there, the hidden prisons, all the rest of it. That, plus that he was the first Arab leader to recognize the new government of Iraq, controversial, challenging. And before him, of course, the long history, 30 years ago, of the recognition of Israel and the cold peace with Israel that has been maintained by Mubarak for all of these decades, guarding against infiltration into Gaza, all of that, protecting Israel. Despite all of those problems, the fact that they reached out to Frank Wisner was very, very smart. But was he in the region? Had they reached out to him days earlier? Are there others who could have been engaged? President Bush 41 on his own called Mubarak to try to persuade him of the new reality, we are told. There were other Arab leaders that the State Department and the President have been reaching out to in the last 48 hours. Could they have been organized earlier to try to impress upon Mubarak that his legacy, his family name, his achievements, however he wants to view them, will depend on the way he leaves office, but that he has to leave, and probably within the next couple of days, to avoid further bloodshed.
Andrea, as we look at live shots right now, it's after dawn. We can see in Tahrir Square the numbers of people there, again, seeming to be rising quickly as the morning grows, as the morning light grows. The U.S. options at this point it seems like the U.S. options have changed in the past 24 hours. Mr. Mubarak, frankly, telegraphed that he would send his forces onto the streets to start to turn the protest movement into one that was terrifying and violent. He said he would do it before he did it, and then we saw in the last 24 hours what it looked like overnight, even further escalation. It's why we stayed with these dramatic live shots overnight, even before dawn broke, as both the Molotov cocktails and the gunfire just continued to ratchet this up. This no longer looks like Tunisia. This now looks like a situation that, if not, I don't want to say civil war. I don't think it's civil war, but it looks like something that is much more grave than a mostly peaceful protest movement. Does that open up new options for the U.S. or close off what used to be options for the U.S.?
I think it closes off options, but it forces them to take some tougher options that have a lot of downside risks with the other Arab leaders. They have to now ratchet up that pressure. The president did that yesterday, but they didn't telegraph it. They were so concerned about any kind of background information getting out. They told some of us, but they certainly didn't properly communicate how concerned the president and his team are, and the fact that they felt the time frame that Mubarak was conceding was far too long. They never thought that what he was suggesting in his conversation with the president and his speech was adequate, but they didn't communicate that properly. And at that point, it was too late to be concerned about the other Arab leaders and about Mubarak himself and his sensitivities. They had to be much more direct, I think, is the conclusion that people I've interviewed today, Nicholas Burns and Ken Pollack, people far more experienced than I am in foreign policy because they actually practice it for a living. They are saying that the administration has to move more quickly on that. At this stage, though, now that things have turned and become violent, and you have in the last 24 hours a completely different situation, starting at around 8 o'clock Eastern time in New York, East Coast time, it really did change. And once that happened, even though Mubarak had telegraphed it, it's a whole new ballgame. We not only have to worry about our people on the ground, and you've heard what the State Department has said about people getting to the airport. By the way, they have revised that in the last few minutes, that they don't want people to leave before the curfew. They want people to wait until the curfew is lifted and then go to the airport if they do want to leave. It's still a voluntary departure, but if they want to leave on a government charter, they have to do it on Thursday, most likely, because there's no guarantee that there will be safety going to the airport. They're now concerned clearly about either martial law being declared or about violence, more violence being possible toward Americans and towards other nonpartisans around the rest of Cairo and getting to the airport. And conceivably, if the government were to fall, or if there is martial law, about planes being able to get out safely. So that's their concern, but they don't want people to leave before the curfew is lifted. But to your direct question, Rachel, I think it is a lot trickier now. Anytime you have this kind of violence, it's even more difficult to communicate. The embassy will be open during working hours for U.S. citizens, not for other people. But it's just all the more difficult for them to try to get Mubarak to leave voluntarily. And the other point that Brian Williams and Richard Engel were making was that the U.S. government has some influence diplomatically. The last ditch effort would be to threaten a removal of aid. It's been $1.3 billion this year of military aid and another $200 million of civilian aid, economic aid. But the other threat is some sort of cut of the funds down the road, and Congress certainly would consider that even if the administration doesn't push it itself. The final point that Brian and Richard were making, correctly, is military-to-military communication. Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was in direct communication with his counterpart, and at every level, as Brian points out, you have officers who've been trained or have done advanced training at our military academies and at our universities, and those are the communications and relationships that exist and can be utilized at this time to tell the Army that at this stage, if Mubarak doesn't leave, and if the circle of advisors, the small circle of advisors around him, can't persuade him to leave, that the military has to do that task.
Be an astonishing turn of events if that happens. NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell joining us live by phone tonight. Andrea, thank you for your time and your insight. I really appreciate it.
Of course, Rachel.
We will be right back with the New America Foundation, Steve Clemens. What you're seeing right here are live pictures of downtown Cairo, where things are hotter than we expected them to be at this time and getting hotter. Please stay with us. We're live.